So I now want to get into some sources of stress. So a lot of us tend to have a good idea where our stress comes from. Sometimes stress creeps up on us and we may feel especially as stressed one day and we don't entirely know why. But quite often we do know where our stress comes from. But I really want to highlight two sources of stress, and that's internal sources of stress and external sources of stress. Now, the internal source of stress comes from things like pessimism. So if we're somebody who's really pessimistic, we sort of see the negative in situations, that can be a big source of stress. It's kind of a road that if we go down, we're just inviting stress into our lives if we're really taking that negative attitude all the time. If we're a rigid thinker and we lack flexibility in our thinking, that can be a source of stress. So if we're someone that really likes things to always be a certain way and we don't like to veer from that, if we don't have flexibility to sort of go with the flow in different situations, we're very stuck on the way we want things to be. A lot of that stuff is out of our control. So if we're faced with that, that can be a big source of stress, very difficult to manage. Another one would be negative self-talk. So that's all about the messages that we give ourselves inside our head often. So whether it's calling ourselves names, labeling ourselves in negative ways. So the self-talk that we sort of have inside ourselves can really be stressful. So it's really important to be aware of sort of how you talk to yourself. And they often say talk to yourself like you would a good friend, even though that is more difficult to do sometimes. Unrealistic expectations is another one. The unrealistic expectations, whether it's on ourselves, whether it's towards people in our lives, if there's ways that we always think things should be, then really difficult to manage because we do not have control of a lot of things outside of us in our environment. And certainly we don't have control over other people. So if we expect a certain level of performance or an expectation out of ourselves or other people, if that doesn't happen, then it can be a huge source of stress for us. So that's some internal sources of stress. These are all things that are workable. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you do that when we talk about management techniques. Now, the external sources of stress can be things like major life changes. They could be things like work and school, financial problems, strong financial issues, relationship issues, whether it be a divorce or whether things are going really poorly in your relationship, being busy, being too busy, burning the candle at both ends and feeling like we're running around. We have so much on our plate and we just can't keep up and there's not enough hours in the day. So some of those external sources can really add to our stress level. Some of those things we have some control over and some we just have to try to manage and get through and survive. But I just want to take a moment to highlight some of those sources of stress, just to give you a little bit of thought on that. And maybe you can think about what your internal and external sources of stress are. Now, what I want to follow that with is something called microstress. And this is the stress that doesn't necessarily jump out at us. We all know what the large stressors are. We often know what the chronic stresses are, the ones that continue to be in our lives and sort of continue to impact us. But the microstresses are ones that are sort of insignificant, but over time they add up and can really decrease our overall well-being and how we feel. So these are small stressors that we're exposed to each and every day, but they often sort of just fly under the radar. They're not significant maybe at the time, but as they add up, and you may experience 10 or 15 micro stressors in a given day, they may add up to accumulate into a large amount of stress, which certainly may impact some of the things we talked about before, may impact your relationships, may impact how you're feeling, how much joy you get in your life. Lots of different areas of your life they could impact. So they could do this over time. And some of the micro stressors that I'm talking about could be losing your keys when you're about to go out the door, not knowing where your keys are. Maybe having an argument with your partner just as you're going out the door. Maybe having an argument at work. Getting up late for work. So it might be getting up late, having to race around. Maybe you're stuck in some traffic that's annoying you. Those are things that we generally have to deal with on a fairly regular day, but we don't recognize the impact of these micro stressors until it's often too late. We recognize we're under a great deal of stress. Maybe we can't figure out why. So maybe the source of our stress are these micro stressors, the things that are happening a little bit each day. So we will get into the micro stress a little more. I'm going to make the micro stresses a topic for our leisure factor presentation. And we're going to talk a little bit about micro stressors and how we can work through those and start to recognize them a little more. So that's a little bit on micro stressors. And you can kind of take stock in what micro stressors do you deal with, maybe ones that you dealt with today.